Hello everyone and welcome to How to Mic Up a Drum Kit ready for a studio session. Today we'll be miking up a traditional jazz style drum kit. We'll be using the Avantone Pro Kick Sub Kick microphone. We'll use the Shure Beta 52A for our kick port, a Beta 91A for our kick in, Shure SM58s for the snare drum, an Audix D4 for the floor tom, an Audix D2 for the rack tom, a pair of Audix SX1MP for our ride and hi-hat, AKG C4 for the O-heads, and an Aston Spirit for our room mic. When you place your kick in mic, it should be on a pillow or a hoodie or something, because if it's on the bottom of the kick drum, it will rattle and ruin your recording. This mic is for capturing the slap and attack of the kick drum. It should be roughly in the middle of the drum, pointing at where the beater hits the head. Next we've got our kick port mic. Port mics give you a full capture of the kick, capturing most of the frequencies of the kick drum, getting both the slap and some of the sub. When you place this mic, you want to make sure it's not touching the edge of your porthole, because the skin will rattle against the mic capsule and you'll most likely hear that in your recording. You might also damage the skin of the drum. I did actually place this on the wrong hole, you will see me move it over. This won't affect the sound of the recording and the placement will be the exact same. Next up we've got our sub kick mic. This is a really big diaphragm, so it'll be really good at picking up those sub frequencies and round out the bottom of your kick, giving it a fuller and fatter tone. You want it to be about an inch or two from the kick drum, so we're giving that resonance head plenty of room to breathe and we're minimising proximity effect. Here's an up close of those placements. We're making sure that the port mic isn't touching the edge of the porthole, the sub mic has enough clearance, and the kick in mic is pointing up at that beater head. Next we're going to set up our snare. We're using two mics. The top mic is to capture the attack of the stick hitting the snare. Our bottom mic is to capture the wire sound that actually makes a snare a snare. When we're setting up these mics, you want them to essentially be meeting at a 90-degree angle in the middle of the drum. This will stop us from getting any phase issues. We're using SM57s because they can withstand high SPL, which is really important considering the snare drum is the loudest drum in the kit. 57s are also super durable. This means if they get knocked or hit by the drummer while they're playing, your mic won't be damaged. You want them just to peep over the edge of the drum so that they're as out of the way as possible. Here's a little bit of a closer look at that placement. And this diagram shows you that they're meeting in the middle at 90 degrees and picking up the top and the snare wires. Next we're doing our toms. We're kind of keeping the same principle with these placements, with the mic just peeping over the edge of the drum to keep out the way of the drummer, whilst picking up the sound that bounces across the skin of the drum. The D2 and the D4 are essentially the same mic, but the D4 is slightly more responsive to lower frequencies, which is useful because floor toms are a lower frequency drum and they are usually tuned the lowest out of the toms. You might have clip-on mics for your toms like the Sennheiser E604s. These are fine. Me personally, I'd keep these reserved for live sound where directionality is really important and isolation is the priority. But for a setting like this, where we're only recording the drums and then there's no bass or anything else, I like to use a mic that has a slightly bigger diaphragm and is slightly better quality. I also like the E609s, but the D2 and the D4 are just what I had on hand for today's session. Again, here's just a closer look at those placements, peeping over the edge, keeping out of the way, picking up the sound from across the tom. Moving on to our hi-hat and our ride, we're using an Audix SCX1MP. This is a small diaphragm condenser microphone, so it's perfect for cymbals. This means it will mostly pick up high end and will also be able to withstand high SPL, which is important because cymbals are very loud. When we place this mic, we want it to be a couple inches above the hi-hat. If your mic is too close, you'll get something called proximity effect. This is where you'll get an over-representation of your low end from your cymbal in your recording and it will sound muddy and not very crisp or clear. Also, when we place that mic, we're pointing it slightly away from the rest of the kit. This is to give us more isolation from the snare drum. It's impossible to get complete isolation when recording drums, but we can take measures like that to minimise it. We're doing a similar thing with the ride cymbal, pointing it at the bell of the ride cymbal, but also between the gap between the floor tom and the snare. We're pointing it at the bell because 90% of the time when drummers are using the ride cymbal, they're hitting in and around that bell area, and we're just trying to avoid the spill from our floor tom and our snare, pointing it in that area. Next, we're moving on to overheads. We're using C414s in a spaced pair configuration. I have a video deep diving into 3 different types of overhead configurations, so I'll put that in the corner if you want to give it a look. When we place these stands, we want to be nice and high. Overheads are a little bit different from the other mics we've placed so far because this isn't a close miking technique. We're not aiming to capture one sound, we're trying to capture an image of the whole kit. So we want to keep them nice and high above the kit so that we can really get that full image. When we're placing our first mic, we want our first mic to be facing directly down, roughly covering a bit of our snare, a bit of our crash, and a bit of our hi-hat. It's important that the overhead isn't directly above the snare, because when we pan these later in post, we'll have an over-representation of the snare drum in one ear of our mix, and we don't want that. When we place our next mic, we're roughly going to place it above our ride and our other crash cymbal, but then we're going to use a jack lead, an XLR or a rope to measure the distance from our first mic to our second mic. We're going to use our snare as the anchor point and compare the distances of the mics from the centre of the snare. This is again because we don't want too much snare in either side of our overheads, and doing this should help us avoid phase issues. We're using the C414 because it's a large diaphragm microphone. This means it will give us a whole range of frequencies from the kit, and it'll give us the representation we're looking for with this configuration of that whole image of the kit. If that's not really the sound you're going for and you want more cymbals and less snare and toms and things like that, you might want to try the XY configuration from my other video, which will target those higher frequencies better. The C414 has multiple polar patterns. Just make sure it's on the cardioid setting. It looks a little bit like a baked bean. You can see that I'm just measuring the distances between those overheads and making the adjustments to make sure that they are in that ballpark of being the same distance from the snare. Here I'm just setting up our Aston Spirit as a room mic. This mic has a high pass filter on it. You want to make sure to turn off any filters your mic might have, because that will apply an EQ to your microphone wide recording, and that will apply filters to your mix that you might not want. Like the C414, this mic has multiple polar patterns. For room mics, you almost always want to set your mic to omnidirectional. This allows us to capture the sound of the kit and the sound of the room. Where you place your room mic will be dependent on the room that you're in. Some spots will sound better than others, so if you have time during a session, ask your drummer to play a groove, walk around the room, and just listen to what spots sound better. Here I'm starting to plug everything in. I choose to do this last because setting up stands is much easier if there's nothing to trip over and there are no cables running where you might want to place a microphone. I've put the channel list in the corner in the order that I plugged the mics into the wall box. You don't have to use this. You might have multiple wall boxes in your studio, you might have a different way that makes sense to you. The reason I do this order is because I do something called bottom-up mixing, and if I record my tracks in this way, it means I shouldn't have to reorder any tracks when I come to mix it, as the elements are already in the order that I want them to be. If you're using any ribbon microphones, before you plug anything in, go and check that there's no phantom power turned on for the input that you're plugging the microphone into. It will just destroy your microphone if there is. In this studio there's a stage-like setup, but your studio might not have that. I'm just running my cables along the edge so that there's no risk of trip hazard or anyone standing on the cables and damaging them. You might also notice that I'm calling the cables at the bottom of my stands after I ran them to the wall box. This just reduces the chance of people tripping and standing on your cables again, and it will keep your studio looking a bit nicer and a bit cleaner. When you're calling your cables, you want to make sure you're using the Abbey Road method or the over-under technique I've heard some people call it. This will just keep your cables lasting longer, allow your cables to lie flatter when you put them back, and make setup much quicker because you won't need to spend half your session untangling cables from the last time you put them away. You'll see people wrapping XLRs around and round mic stands. You don't need to do that. For things like overheads, it's great to go around once or twice to stop your cables falling on your drum mount or your equipment, but you don't need to wrap it around loads. You risk stretching and damaging your cables. It also just takes longer. It's way more annoying to set up and take down. Before you plug everything in, you might want to ask your drummer to play for a little bit on the kit if they haven't already, to make sure that they're comfortable with where their kit's set and that no mics are in their way. Now I'm just doing a sound check. We'll go through each drum in the order that we plugged it in, just asking the drummer to hit straight crotchets at a medium tempo. We're then just going to adjust the gain of each microphone so that it's not coming in too hot and peaking, but also so that it's not too quiet and it's at a usable volume. Gain staging is far more important than most people realise. If you get this stage wrong and your takes are either too quiet or peaking, you're going to really struggle to make them sound good during the mixing stage. Some mics need phantom power, so make sure to turn that on for that specific microphone or you won't get any signal. Your gear might say plus 48 volts, this one has a little 0 that has a slash through it. I've seen some that have a little ghost. Make sure you mute your desk before you turn phantom power on, because otherwise your speakers are going to make a loud pop. Make sure your overheads are set to the same gain level as well, otherwise your mix will sound unbalanced. Once you're getting signal through all your inputs, get your drummer to run through the song once or twice, make adjustments to your gain, listen to each mic in isolation to make sure your placements are right and you're not getting proximity effect, and then do a rough balance and you should be ready to record. That's it, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments. I've linked all the mics in the description if you want to grab one for yourself.